Yeah, well, it started actually 60 years back. I wrote my first book in 58. It was an existentialism. Its name was Nihilism with a question mark. And the situation philosophically in Norway at that time, it was not long time after the Second World War. And Norway is geoculturally and geopolitically in between the European continent and the Anglo-Saxon world. And it was a need to reconciliate, both culturally and philosophically, these tensions that were caused by the war. So in philosophy, it was a question of bringing together somehow the virtues of analytic philosophy and the insights of European continental philosophy. And here at the University of Bergen, that was a main attempt all over the philosophy in Norway, also for myself. And actually we started with the late Wittgenstein, philosophical investigations on the one side, and Heidegger, Being and Time on the other. And what we worked out was a presuppositional analysis of actions called praxeology, to see whether there are some knowing, tacit knowing called then, and competences and capabilities that were part of the background for action. So that was praxeology, which brought us together sort of from the analytic and the continental position. Then it was further developed also not only for actions but for speech acts. Then inspired by analytic philosophy, but also by Apel and Habermas in the continental school at that time. And then we also looked for presuppositions somehow, using what Gilbert Wright called informal arguments from reduction from arguments, arguments from absurdity. Reductio ad absurdum arguments in an informal sense. And it ended up then with a way of thinking which, if you like, would try to incorporate analytic virtues, as I said, but also the questions of the continental way of thinking, but in a more gradual way than was maybe usual in the continental sense. Not so many dichotomies, but more a gradual way of looking upon notions and arguments. What you said about the more pluralistic aspect to it. So I think that's, broadly speaking, a way that I made and many philosophers in the early years after the Second World War made. And then other things came later, I mean, theory of modernity, modernization, theory of the sciences and the humanities, etc. But that's, I think, is the main background, yes. Well, that's an interesting aspect with the situation of the Second World War, not only the reconciliation attempt, but also we, in the small Scandinavian countries, we had to trade with everybody. And since we had all these three languages, German, English and French in school, in addition to our own languages, we both spoke and wrote in all these languages. And many of the people I mentioned so far, they wrote in German, certainly. And also, when it comes to theories of modernization, then you have the whole background from Weber, Max Weber and Habermas naturally bringing in, whereby also the question of various forms of rationality are very important. And there you have the early tradition of the Frankfurt School. By the way, I was in California during the Vietnam War as a research assistant for Marcuse, who was then one of the first generation. And then, you know, you had on the one side the view of rationality as basically instrumental rationality, and then a sort of the other side, which is then aesthetics and art, if you like. And then you have the second generation with Apel and Habermas, whereby for one thing, the social sciences, that is the interpretive and argumentative sciences, are put in the focus and elaborated as a more diverse theory of the various sciences and humanities. And then we should use the German term Wissenschaft, which we also have in the Scandinavian languages, meaning that we include not only the natural sciences, but also the humanities, and also theology and law, and all the disciplines actually that you have at the university. So the notion of modernity then, with the second generation of if you like, Frankfurter School, would also involve the development of the various sciences and their relationships to the various institutions again, the relationship between institutions and various forms of rationality in the sciences and in practice. Yeah, that's a special term in Norwegian. It was presented first time in 1975 by the Research Council. Called in German, it would be Wissenschaftstheorie, and it doesn't fit with the English term, since Wissenschaftsscience also, as I just mentioned, would include also the social sciences and the humanities and theology and all the rest, all the topics actually at the university. So the idea was that at the university, but also in the modern society, where the sciences do play, and sciences and humanities do play an important role in expertise and other kinds of activities, then it's important to see their role and their virtues and shortcomings, if you like. I mean, what you see in the modern society is that you have lots of different disciplines, and you could say that there are two things that the student should learn. Should learn a discipline or a model, and that this discipline and model is not the reality. I mean, economists would see something, social anthropologists and other things about the same topic, if you like. So this plurality of perspectives is an aspect of the way that rationality takes place in modern societies. And that was part of the need which was seen by the Research Council, that we should focus on it. And then, so it takes all the sciences and humanities, and there are two requirements as to the term theory, which is not a good studies or research, whatever. And that is, if you talk about physics, you should know enough about physics to be able to have a conversation with those in the field. That kind of double competence. So it's not only kind of social, scientific research from the outside, if you like, which is all right too. But you should, if you go into a field, you should know the field from the inside. So that kind of knowledge of what you are talking about, but also the kind of reflective, if you like, philosophical insight into the presupposition, and here it comes again, into the presuppositions that are constitutive, the kind of concepts you have and the kind of concepts you do not have, to see the limitations, the presuppositions and limitations. And the background, and that also goes back to Arne Næss and the whole expansion of the universities and the various sciences after the Second World War, is that it's on the one side a very positive attitude and curious attitude as to what colleagues are doing in other fields. I mean, very positive, but also critical then. So this, and that has to do with being human maybe at the university. You should take other people seriously, being interesting, trying to know what they're doing, but also be open to criticism and self-criticism. So that kind of criticism and self-criticism and plurality is then seen as very important parts of rationality. So then there are two sort of things you should try to avoid. The one thing would be to be half-modern, to stick to natural sciences and technology alone, and to ignore the interpretive and argumentative sciences. Those are half-modern. And if you look in the world around, you'll see that there are places where people are pretty half-modern. They stay to natural science and technology and ignore all the interpretive, argumentative sciences, and to bring the whole spectrum of the various disciplines into the focus. At the university, being aware of it in your research to see the limitations, also in education for the students, but also being a consultant for political agents and other things, and in the public sphere. That kind of reflection in the academic world and in those who are educated by the academic world. And that goes certainly also into the whole discussion about post-truth, since it means that in order to get trust in science today, you have to take the limitations of sciences, I mean the uncertainties and the perspective aspect of it and limitation to that. But also at the same time to respect the gradual and the better arguments. There it comes again, the better arguments, which is a main notion, as we know, in transcendental pragmatics, to seek the better arguments, to get away from the worse, less good arguments, that kind. So it's a way of taking care of the Enlightenment ideas, if you like. And that means also to be open to counter-arguments. I mean, look at what we are doing at the universities. People are doing very different things. Some are in the labs, some are in the fields, some are in the oceans doing something on fishing or the library. But at the end, we all have a disputas. We discuss and we try to find good arguments against not so good arguments. So that openness for counter-arguments as part of the Enlightenment project. And these things, I think, are common to all modernity, and the institutions for it, and the university as an institution. So this, I think, and here I go along with the second generation of the Frankfurt School, among many others, for sure. I mean, Popper would say, and analytic philosophy also. This, it seems to me, very important. That this is where the theory of the sciences and humanities will come in. But then, naturally, there are great differences between various regions of the world, how institutions and learning processes have come along. That's also why it was very important, not only to have very good friends and colleagues in China, which you have, but when you have people with different historical backgrounds, learning processes, you see something in addition. But then we get into the other aspect to it. One thing is what is common to modernity, which is common to all of us. Let's say technology and ecology are external challenges today. All the sciences are there for all of us to take into account. But then there are the differences, learning processes, and how that, and that was another aspect to it, and multiple modernities. That's the name of the book I wrote. What is typical Norwegian or not? I mean, the experiences from the Second World War, the occupation was a common background. We were interested in political issues long before the Vietnam War. Those are historical accidents, if you like, and will differ from one country to the other. But the other problems which I mentioned about the role of rationality, the various forms of rationality in the sciences and at the university and society, but also how to, I would say, how to see the relationship between fallibilism and truth claims and better arguments, that those aren't typically Norwegian, but it came up in our setting due to this tension between analytic and continental philosophy. So there are some typical aspects, and some of them are pretty common, universal, and let me also add that time passes, and those were the years, starting years, but in 60s, 70s, into the 80s, but I mean now people have been all around, and you have in philosophy, also in the theory of sciences, you have specialization to a large degree. I mean, so much is said and done, you have to have your projects, and there is both the strengths and the problems of specialization, and that you get also into philosophy. But it's a challenge which also again brings in the need to reflect upon your own presuppositions. But just to your question, I think, globalization and specialization is also a thing that you will find in, for good and bad, in the sciences and the philosophy. But again, I mean, you have to specialize, but you also have to be aware of your presuppositions. And what was typical for Norwegian philosophy at an early stage would not be that typical today, since it's so diversified, if you like. Well, if you look at the history of philosophy, and I've been working with the history of philosophy quite a lot, and you have the variety, the Chinese, Indian, the Greek, etc., and so on and so forth. I think to start with it, first of all, yeah, how do you define philosophy? You could have a very broad notion of philosophy whereby all worldviews are philosophies. I mean, but if you have a more, should you say, restricted one, where you have to say, well, philosophy has to do with sort of arguing for your position, not only having a worldview, but arguing for that worldview. If you take that more restricted definition, you might say that, well, first of all, philosophers try to discuss with each other, in those who are within the same school or branch or whatever. I mean, Confucians and legalists and what have you, I mean, in Greek philosophy and so on. So you discuss with your own people, but then also, in order to know that you are better than those who are not in your own field, at some stage, not all and every, but you should also think about the other people are doing. If you think you are right, and the others are not as right as you are, how could you know without knowing what the others are saying? So there is a tendency in philosophy, you can't look at everybody, but you also have to look at those in the neighboring fields to see what's typical for your things. So then you have a discussion within your field or school or what have you, but then you have a discussion with each other, which you can see more or less in philosophy. But not only that, and here the sciences will come in also, because then you have other fields like natural sciences. I mean, that triggered off empiricism and rationalism, and then Kant came and tried to make a compromise, and Hegel said, I mean, you had an ongoing thing, but it was triggered to some extent by the new natural sciences that were experimental and mathematically formulated. So you have discussions within the school of philosophy, between the schools of philosophy, but also with those other, should we say, institutions in modern societies, like the sciences and humanities, also ideologies and religions, where truth claims, validity claims are made. And philosophers, not all of them all the time, but some of them sometime will, as a profession, will have to look into it. And then, closing up to your question again, there are events. I think it's very interesting to see that Confucius and Plato, pretty much at the same time, says 500 years before Jesus Christ, if you like, that they saw crisis in their society, and what did they say? Well, crisis, and you need education. Both of them reacted, re-education, and a deeper education, from music to rituals and everything of it. So what does that mean? Well, it meant that they weren't only triggered by arguments and positions by colleagues, but also about what happened in society. So, I mean, what happened and today, technology, for instance, let's take that. I mean, Kant's fourth question, what is man? What is a human being? Yes, well, but you know, today we have a lot of biology, so you have to see what's man with animals, and you have the question of gradualism in that. But then you have on that technology, and you have transhumanists. And what can you do with biotechnology, etc., etc. And here you have to look into these fields, and they are not only positions, but they are realities in the world. I mean, technology is also a reality in the world. What I'm saying is that philosophy is also triggered by actions. And in Norwegian society, well, what was triggered? Institutions, for instance, I mean, we were run by Mandarinat from 1814. We nearly had no nobility, luckily. It was abolished formally in 1821, 7 families. But we had meritocratic state officials. They were not wealthy, but they had to get their exams, like in China, from the university. They were lawyers and theologians. They took part of the building of the country and education. And it's clear that these institutions, it made something to how theology developed, but also law, etc. And this, I think, is an aspect of the Scandinavian countries, that you had Protestant priests who became state officials taking care of education, but they were socialized within the university, where they had to read critical things. They couldn't be educated in a personal college downtown in the Midwest or something. They had to be socialized within the university together with lawyers, together with philosophers and natural scientists and all that. And that, again, I think has to do with being human as a scholar, but also as a person in the modern society. So that was, I think, part of what's typical for the Scandinavian countries, to which extent it, well, made things for philosophy later. It at least made things about how rationality took place. And add to that that we had reading farmers, free, they were not, owned their own ground, had legal protection for their own ground, and they could read. That is due also to Protestantism from 1730s. They had to read, everybody had to read, so they could read, they could organize, and they acted actually with all kinds of rationality. They were good in economics, like the Calvinians, I mean, working morality, but also in argumentation and interpretation. They interpreted the Holy Scripture and the laws, and they said that the upper class wasn't right in interpreting the laws, and you got the tension between popular movements that were brought up with all kinds, in practice, all kinds of rationality, and mandarinat from the top, powerful but not very rich. And I think that's part of the core, if I'm not a historian, but I do something about history of modernity. And I think this is part of the background of the special aspects of modernity today. But I mean, we are under the same crisis and tensions as everybody by global capitalism and technology and ecology and what have you. So, but that's part of the history. And but at that time, philosophy was a very, very small field actually at the Norwegian universities. It was basically these are the practical fields, had to say. Whether it's typically for Norway, I'm not sure. We have some traditions and some institutions we should critically evaluate, and if we like them, we should take care of them, etc., etc. But let me take another approach to your question here. To be human, first of all, I think it's important that philosophy is not only the bookshelves. I mean, there are various activities in philosophy. You read, you write, you listen, and you talk. These four things. And you shouldn't do just one, but maybe at the time. But these four things are important. But also, I think there is something about traveling in the sense that you should meet people who do things differently about problems you are yourself interested in. So, and that's the other aspect to it, that in order to understand philosophical points, it's not only, how do you say, to exchange information. It's something, it's a formative aspect. It's a socialization, if you like. It's a role-taking. You learn to see how the other person would look at the problem. And that takes this, it's a practice. It's actually, philosophy is also a practice. Here again, education by Confucius and Plato, they had a point. I mean, you should do a lot of it alone, but there is something in learning from other people, to see yourself from the outside, and that kind of growth, which is related to, I would say, socialization, that kind of critical self. Yeah, you should both be critical and open at the same time. That kind of education is, I think, it's part of the ethos of philosophy, actually, and where it will tie up with very many other aspects in human societies. I mean, from basic education and family life, etc. But therefore, I think it's very valuable that this conference, the 24th World Conference in Beijing, has being learning to be human. I think this is both a very deep human general problem. It's a problem that is related deeply and essentially to what we are doing as philosophers, at least should do at some times, part of it. And I would add that in these times, with all the tensions around, I mean, you see it all over the place. It's with all our different backgrounds, it's very important that we come together. Also as fields, naturally other people also come together, respectfully, listening to each other, trying to understand the deep differences in institutional developments, in learning processes, in wars and crises, in class structure, in culture. All those might be fairly different, but though still, and here we are back to the historical situatedness, that we are today, from wherever we come, we are also challenged by some of the same crises and problems, and we have some of the same resources at the same time as we have different resources. And that was also, first of all, for me, I went to France, Germany, and then to the United States. I mean, just to change borders and change languages and live in other countries, that was in itself a learning process. But even more so when I got some of my very, very best friends in China, 30 years back. And to learn to, both to understand Chinese philosophy and gradually to understand some of the Chinese history. And after 30 years, even though I have too many languages, and I unfortunately couldn't learn Chinese if I'd been younger, I've done so. But I started to understand the spinal reactions of the Chinese, and that's something, I mean, the feelings, and has to do with how crises have been understood and so on and so forth. Same in Germany, same in France with the revolution and the war. I mean, to understand those things, I mean, you can't just go to a conference and speak English and read a book and go back again. You have to meet people and be friends with them. You have to talk about the big issues, but also about the small issues. And I think there is something about that togetherness, to live together. Actually, some kind of, best at the end, some friendship, which I was happy to experience. Not intendedly, but it came like that. So I think that is a very, very important general topic, and a very important topic now, and very, very glad that it was brought up as a main topic of this conference, and I'm sure it will be successful. There are various questions. One question, which is what is, how should you say, paradigmatically human? What is, I mean, what we think about human beings that are grown, more or less capable of speaking, acting, responsible for their acts, etc. And that is the more general and very deep and important question. And then you have the questions how we learn by socializations. But then you have the borderline questions, as I mentioned. So, I mean, not all of us have that kind of lives. You have those who will never become mature human beings. You have those at the end of their lives who have lost some of their capabilities, and so on and so forth. There are many human beings that are not persons in the strict definition of the term, but belong to the species. So you have that kind of problem on the one side, should you say, on the biological side, and we know more about it than Kant would know, because we have biology and Darwin and whatever, and what we can do also. So it's a diverse notion what it is to be a human being. I mean, and then at the other side, the thing about technology. What can a human being do which a robot can't do? And again, I would say socialization due to a bio body. Being born, being a child, learning languages, learning practical things, having youth, sexuality, having children, disease, learning. All, if you take away the bio body, only technical body. You aren't born, you do not have a childhood, you don't have a youth, you do not have sexuality, you do not have children. You will get sick, hurted, no death. I mean, and if you take away all the notions and all the learning processes that are tied up to finally somehow to the biobody, then I think what you end up with is a very meager thing. So here I think you could argue that that's my argument. Now I'm within the question. I wrote a paper, a book I gave out in German before war, Christmas year, on human dignity. And even though I'm a gradualist on the biological aspect, I'm not a gradualist when it comes to technology. I think there is something having a bio body and all the socialization that goes with it, which has to do with the dignity of a human being. Then there are other things about transhumanism. I mean, they have very... yeah, that's an important thing. It seems to me that people like Ray Kurzweil and the people in Silicon Valley talking about singularity and how we'll become more and more like robots. It seems to me that they lack the kind of political and social notions. I mean, there will be tensions, I mean, between those and other people and between those who should stay on Earth and who should leave it. And how do you regulate those things? I mean, and there might be bad persons who are with powerful technologies. I mean, technology itself can't regulate these conflicts of interests and the meanness of some individuals being in... So you need much more than technology. Technology can solve a lot of problems, but also there are problems caused by technology, loss of jobs, etc., instability due to that. But again, human beings can't just be technical. These, I think, are important aspects to it. And yeah, so who should be the very best human being? That will always be what positive aspects, but there are some limiting notions that I think are important for the very notion of a human being. Well, three things tying up with what I have already said. The first thing is whether Chinese or not, I mean, to be together with colleagues, human beings and philosophers is also valuable. So that's the first thing. I mean, we are not just Chinese and Norwegians, we are human beings and colleagues. So that's the first part. I mean, they are interesting colleagues and good friends. The best friends I have are in China, some of them. So yes. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that I learned, as I also mentioned, I learned a lot about Chinese history and philosophy, and it ties together somehow, though. I mean, so, and that's part of being a professional philosopher in the modern world, to know what other people have been doing and thinking and see the similarities and dissimilarities. That's the second point. Then the third point, which I would also stress actually, is that you learn to see yourself in a new way. Actually this book on multiple modernities, which was published and I wrote it in English, has been translated in Norwegian and Russian last year, and also in Chinese. The whole inspiration for that is that when we were discussing what does it mean to be Chinese and modern. And then we had a discussion going on. Yeah, learned a lot from that. And then I got the question, what does it mean to be Norwegian and modern? And then the notion came up, Western. And I thought, Western. United States or Europe? We see with Trump and they said huge differences. Institutions, learning processes, how the state officials, markets, culture, nobility or not nobility, great differences. And then if you look at Europe, and everybody would see today, it was not as clear maybe earlier, but today everybody sees it's Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. I mean, and then Scandinavia. And then I started thinking about, and I had never thought about it in those terms. Actually, naivety maybe on my part, but I never thought about what could be typical about the welfare state in the Scandinavian countries with a lot of trust, etc. How come? And that was a question I got from my Chinese colleagues. And then I started giving lectures in Shanghai. And that ended up with this book of multiple modernities. So I learned a lot, I mean, in this dialogue with the Chinese, inspired by them, and then I went into... So that's also part of how... it's just a case to show how you start thinking through a lot of experiences which you somehow already knew, but you hadn't worked them through with other people in the way. So on these three things, the general thing, this thing of learning the country, this China, but also reflectively learning yourself. And again, it adds to being human, I think, to recognize the others and to see the special status of what, from where you are coming yourself. And, yeah. China is a great country, a big country, and with a great effort now to catch up in all fields and to know what the Chinese will find out. Let me say this. I was impressed by a very special thing. There are those people who are so eager to adapt to other things that they forget themselves. And there are those who stick so much to the things from where they came that they do not learn from new things. What impressed me actually, and this is not meant to be flattering, but maybe it is, but actually what impressed me with these friends that came to Norway from 30 years back and so on was the combination. That on one side they were proud of being Chinese, no doubt they should go back to their country and do their very best. I mean, yeah, and they were very open to learn. And I think that combination, that should be taken care of. That I think is very useful. But I guess then in philosophy there will be people in all fields of philosophy in China. As it also, in all countries now, you have specializations and projects and you will have it in all fields. My hope would only be that we can collaborate also on theories of sciences and modernization, multiple and not multiple modernities, and also these Enlightenment ideas about both praxeology, presuppositions for acts, tacit knowing, also for speech acts, for inherent demands for giving better reasons and for taking seriously the claim you are. So that this part of the philosophy will also be taken care of, I'm pretty sure, but that's my hope, and I would like to have many lives in the future to see what's going on. And I think the conference is very good. It's very good that it is in Shanghai now, because globally we are in a situation where we need to come together and think and discuss basic problems and learn to know each other. So I think it's actually very good that it is in China, in Beijing these days, and philosophy is just one activity among many other activities. I mean, we can't solve the world and all that, but we can contribute, and we should contribute. And I think this is a good event for sticking to these activities that we should stick to and meet each other. I look very much forward to it, and I really think it will be successful and a very good conference.
Okay. Tusen tack, Professor Skirbekk, and Happy Chinese New Year.
Happy Chinese New Year for you and your family. 谢谢。